Hello, welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Here I have another classic book that I think all of you will enjoy. Now, all of us, I'm sure, love chocolate, but this guy named Henry Green loves chocolate. He loves it so much that, well, you'll get the idea once we read into it. Here it is, the 1972 classic Chocolate Fever by Robert Kimmel Smith. I want to give a shout out to my friend Jalen Hank, because I know he really loves this book. So, this is for you, Jalen. So, you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 1. Meet Henry Green. There are some people who say that Henry Green wasn't really born, but was hatched, fully grown from a chocolate bean. Can you believe that? Anyways, this particular Henry Green we are speaking of was really born, not hatched, and had a wonderful mom and dad in the bargain. His father was tall and lean and wore eyeglasses, except when he was sleeping or in the shower. Obviously. Mama Green, whose name was Enid, was a short, slim woman with blue-gray eyes and a tiny mouth that always seemed to be on the verge of a smile. They all lived in an apartment in the middle of the city, along with Henry's older brother and sister. Mark Green was 10 and tall and very good to Henry. Except when they would argue, which was often, and then he would hit Henry on the head with anything that was handy, which sometimes was hard. But mostly Mark was fun to be with, and only got angry when Henry called him Marco Polo. Mark didn't like that, and who could blame him? I don't. Henry's sister was very, very old, almost 14. She didn't ever argue with Henry or Mark. In fact, she hardly talked to them that at all because she was so old and wise and almost grown up. Her name was Elizabeth. I'm guessing Henry would be around 7 or 8 years old. Anyway, the other morning, which was a school day at the end of the week called Friday, my favorite day of the week growing up, Henry, Mark, and Elizabeth were at the table in the dining room having breakfast. Mark was eating fried eggs. Elizabeth was quietly chewing on her usual breakfast of buttery toast and milk. And Henry was midway through his usual breakfast, too. Chocolate cake, a bowl of Cocoa Krispy cereal and milk, with chocolate syrup in the milk to make it more chocolatey, washed down by a big glass of chocolate milk and 5 or 6 chocolate chip cookies. Sometimes, when it was left over from the night before, Henry would have chocolate pudding, too. And on Sunday mornings, he usually had chocolate ice cream. The truth was that Henry was in love with chocolate, and chocolate seemed to love him. Thank God I'm not allergic to chocolate, otherwise this would be pure torture to read. It didn't make him fat. He was a little on the thin side, in fact. He must have high metabolism. It didn't hurt his teeth. He had never had a cavity in his life. Ah, nice. It didn't stunt his growth. He was just about average height, perhaps even a little tall for his age. It didn't harm his skin, which has always been clear and fair, but most of all, it never gave him a bellyache. And so his parents, perhaps being not as wise as they were kind, let Henry have as much chocolate as he liked. Can you imagine a boy having a chocolate bar sandwich as an after-school snack? Well, Henry did just about every day. And when he ate mashed potatoes, just a few drops of chocolate syrup washed down through seemed to make him taste a lot better. Chocolate sprinkles sprinkled on top of plain buttered noodles were tasty too, not to mention light dusting of cocoa on things like canned peaches, pears, and applesauce. In the Greens' pantry, there was always a giant supply of chocolate cookies, chocolate cakes, chocolate pies, and chocolate candies of every kind. There was ice cream too. Chocolate, of course, and chocolate nut, chocolate fudge, chocolate marshmallow, chocolate swirl, and especially chocolate almond crunch. And all of it was just for Henry. I wonder if Mark and Elizabeth ever liked chocolate themselves. There was only one thing you could say about if there was only if there was one thing you could say about Henry, it was that he surely did love chocolate. Probably more than any other boy in the history of the world, his mother said. How does Henry like his chocolate, Daddy Green would sometimes joke. And we never find out the father's name. Why, he likes it bitter, sweet, light, dark, and daily. And it was true. Up until the day we're talking about right now. Ooh. Chapter 2. A Strange Feeling. Better hurry, kids, Mama Green called from the kitchen. It's almost 8:30. Let's go, Slowpoke, Mark said to Henry. We don't want to be late. Just one more chocolate cookie, said Henry. He popped it into his mouth and, still chewing, went to his room to get his books. On the way to the front door, Henry went through the kitchen and gathered a handful of chocolate kisses to put into his pocket. He liked them to have them handy to munch on at school. But this morning, because he still felt somewhat hungry, Henry stripped the silver wrapping from 2 kisses and popped them into his mouth. Then, after a quick kiss for Mama Green, a kiss that had left a bit of chocolate on her face, Henry, Elizabeth, and Mark headed out the door on their way to school. At the corner, Henry and Mark waved goodbye to their sister, who had to take the big bus to get to her high school. The boys' school, PS 123, was just another block away. At the next corner, Mrs. McIntosh, the crossing guard, waved them across the street. The light is always green for the green, she said. It was her own little joke. And she said it just about every morning. This morning she smiled This morning only Mark, who was extremely polite, smiled. Henry just didn't feel like smiling. In fact, he was beginning to feel a little strange. In the schoolyard, the boys went in separate ways to join their classes. As usual, there was a lot of pushing and shoving and fooling around. But Henry, who was always very good at things like knocking hats off boys' heads and making goofy faces at the girls, was quiet. He didn't even say hi when Michael Burke, his best friend, came along. What's the matter with you? Asked Michael, grinning. What do you mean, what's the matter? Henry said. Can't I just stand here? Do I have to carry on and behave like a nut? Okay, said Michael. You don't have to bite my head off. It's just that you're kind of different today. Not like you at all. Just then the whistle blew and all the children began marching into the school building. I feel funny today, Henry said to Michael. I have the feeling something's going to happen and I don't know what. That exact feeling that something was going to happen stayed with Henry all morning. He felt strange in his homeroom, strange when he went to gym class, and in Mrs. Kimmelfarber's math class. He felt strange all over. Henry couldn't concentrate on what Mrs. Kimmelfarber was saying. He just sort of sat there and stared. Without thinking about it, he was looking at his arm and the back of his hand. And then he noticed something. There were little brown freckles all over his skin. Now this would not have been such a startling discovery except for one thing. Those little brown freckles were not there when he woke up this morning. At the front of the room, Mrs. Kimmelfarber was going through the drill on fractions. She was saying, and if I take 6½ and then subtract 1 1/4, what will I have left? Well, the answer is 5 1/4. She looked directly at Henry, who was looking directly at his arm. Henry, she asked, what will I have left? Little brown spots all over, said Henry. Chapter 3. Mrs. Kimmelfarber's Problem. There was silence in the room for about 2 seconds. Then there was a riot. All the girls began to giggle. The boys chortled and chuckled and laughed right out loud. Henry turned red, and Mrs. Kimmelfarber, who did not appreciate the humor of it all, turned white. She rapped her ruler against the desk and shouted for silence. Henry Green, she said, what is the meaning? Little brown spots all over, said Henry. I was looking at my arm and I have these little brown spots all over, interrupted Mrs. Kimmelfarber. I heard you quite clearly. But you see, Mrs. Kimmelfarber, I didn't have them all my life. I didn't even have this morning. But now I know, Mrs. Kimmelfarber sighed. Now you have them all over. I'd better have a look at them. Taking Henry's arm, She led him to the window. She said as she peered at his arm. Looks like freckles to me. No, ma'am, said Henry, it just can't be. Why not? Said Mrs. Kimmel Farber. Because I have clear and delicate skin like my mother. Is that so? Mrs. Kimmel Farber said. And who told you that, pray tell? My father. Ah, said Mrs. Kimmel Farber. Exactly. Now are you sure you didn't observe this phenomenon before this morning? If that means did I see them, said Henry. No, I didn't. Well then, she said, you, Henry Green, stand right where you are, and class, she said, turning to face the room, you will continue to look at your books until I return. In perfect silence, she added as she went out into the hall. Henry stood as told, while the class looked at him. Mrs. Kimmel Farber walked the few steps down the hall to Mr. Pangallow's room. She looked through the doorway and waited until Mr. Pangallow's glanced in her direction. Catching his eye, she waved him out into the hallway. Listen, Phil, she began earnestly. I want you to take a look at this kid. For heaven's sake, Dolores, said Mr. Pangallow's. I'm right in the middle of America's Vespucci, who has little brown spots all over his arms. Little brown spots. You got me out here for little brown spots? I thought maybe measles. Oh no, said Mr. Pangallow's. Chicken pox? Said Mr. Pangallow's. I'd better take a look. The two of them turned Henry to the light near the window, right in the corner where the potted plants were growing on the window ledge. Mr. Pangallow's poked and prodded, and even took his eyeglasses out of his pocket and put them on. Freckles, he said finally. Just freckles. Are you sure? Mr. Pangallow's round nose twitched and he sniffed the air. Chocolate? He said. Have they brought the chocolate milk upstairs already? Forget the milk, she cried. Look! Now he has them on his face! Oh no, said Henry. Oh yes, said Mrs. Kimmel Farber. Oh my, said Mr. Pangallow's. And they weren't there before? No, 2 minutes ago that boy's face was as clear as day, and now... Henry felt as if his heart were about to drop into his shoes. He swallowed hard and stared at the two teachers, who were staring at his face. Little brown spots all over, said Mrs. Kimmel Farber, and I see more of them coming out even as we speak. A tear, just one, welled up in Henry's right cheek and began to trickle down his cheek, running slowly in and out of the little brown spots. To be continued.